Yeah, hi everybody. I just sent you the email, so I'm sure you'll be listening to this afterwards. But as I just told you, we're going to do this in lab instead, and I just have to load the correct PowerPoint. So we're going to use the lab today for bone review time, and I'm going to come down here and find anything I can look at. I got to find chapter 13. Let me get over here. Sorry about that. I have to re-download it. It's okay. Here we go. Sorry for the little delay. Yeah. And that's going to be down here if you're looking for them. So, I must have 48 of these damn things. Alright, so I'll do A and B. I already started to see D, but this won't hurt to take a look at. I'm going to take a look at them. So let me, and you can see it's like the third download. Ridiculous. Okay. Apologies. Off we go. So, peripheral nervous system is what we're talking about. This is the introductory stuff. We're focusing on the anatomy. We're going to revisit this, as I've told you, with regard to the physiology portion of the program. So, here's how we start with it. So, very much we see effectively all of these things. Receptors, so it's basically the peripheral nervous system is all of the things that are bringing in sensation or sending out motor signals. We'll look briefly at repair, but we'll spend more time with that in physiology, motor activity, maybe a little bit on reflex. That's about it. But anatomically, and I've seen this before, anything that protrudes from the central nervous system by definition is peripheral nervous system. And you're either going to have a sensory, and again, the term we use is afferent for incoming or efferent for outgoing, and always emphasize that first letter because it's just too confusing otherwise. And they either can go to the body, which means bones, joints, muscles, or to organs. So motor can go to both of these areas. And what we see, the motor division, disregarding the sensory division for right now, is referred to as the autonomic or automatic nervous system. We do that in physiology. It has two subdivisions called sympathetic and parasympathetic. You saw a little bit of the parasympathetic in lab last time, particularly when you saw the vagus in that, because that's the parasympathetic innervation to the organs, as well as some of the glandular structures. Remember, the nerves were 3, 7, 9, and 10 particularly is the one that goes to the viscera of the organs that you have. So we continue on with that. What sensation is, awareness of stimulus, and how we interpret them. So that's the subtle distinction, perhaps not so subtle, between sensation and perception. Feeling something and understanding. Did I my finger touch something that had like a little point on it, and I got a tiny puncture, or was it hot? That's the perception aspect. Pretty straightforward. So body, when we talk about somato, meaning the body, wall, limbs, muscles, joints, etc. And there's different kinds of receptors. We have receptors that come from the outside. That's what I'd be talking about if you touch something that was sharp or hot. Proprioceptors, which I talked about constantly with regard to really being internal sensors that are all about body position and muscle and joint and bone position. So you kind of know what your body's doing in time and space and place. And interoreceptors, which are internal receptors. Let's say it's a receptor in your hypothalamus monitoring calcium or sugar or sodium levels, and the different kinds of processing that might go on. So we have different types of this. And again, this is more physiology, so I'm just going to zip through it laundry list style. So things that happen at the level of the receptor, the different pathways that are involved, and we're going to look a little bit more at pathways as well. And I do have to finish those, and I will do that, but I think I'll share that with you in lecture and just do this generally. So I have not completed the last PowerPoint of 12, which is the spinal cord. We got through the vast majority of it, but I do want to go over those tracks a little bit more. There's only a smidgen left with regard to that. And if I get around to it, when I get through this, I might take a quick look-see at that. And so, and as you can see, we'll look at all of these things, receptors and where within a particular field or area, and this is really important, we get to physiology, transduction. It's the whole idea of looking at the being able to change the signal, whether it's a chemical signal from taste, or a pressure signal from hearing, or a visual signal from pigments in the eye, and converting that then into some type of electrical signal, because that's what our brain registers. That's there. And then we look at these different types of things, and particularly we start to look at the difference between graded potentials versus an action potential. And some things will stimulate us, but not sufficient to produce some response or to transmit that to another area. That would be the action potential. And the remarkable ability to adapt. And we have different kinds of receptors. And again, this is more physiology. Phasic ones are faster, tonic ones are slower. We'll review that. So as you can see, there's some that are these fast adapting ones. Okay, pressure, touch, smell, how quickly. When you touch something, you know you touched it and it disappears. When you smell something, how relatively rapidly you adapt or adjust to it. Versus, okay, something, pain takes a little while. Okay, proprioceptors, pretty much a constant signal to know where your body is. That types of things. And this is what I touched on a little bit in lecture, but I did want to continue on with this concept of first, second, and third order neurons. These are classic sensory anatomy. So from the receptor level into the spine, or even sometimes up to the medulla, to what they call a second order neuron. So those are the areas, that first order nerve from the sensor, let's say your finger, where's it going? So it's either going to synapse or meet another nerve in the spine and involve reflexive activity, or it might go all the way up to the brainstem and then eventually be shuttled to the thalamus, and then eventually be shuttled to the part of the brain for you to understand what it is. And that's what the thalamic, which are mostly second order nerves, do. They transmit impulses to the third order. So let me rephrase that. So the ones from the spinal cord and let's say the medulla, the second ones will transmit it to the thalamus, and the thalamus will then get it to the appropriate area of the cerebral cortex where you can perceive it and figure out what it all means. And so these are the projection fibers that we had talked about. And there's all different aspects of it, whether we detect it, how intense it is, where it's occurring. And we'll look at all these things in physiology. Okay. Different ways we can recognize patterns. It's like when you hear playing on, whether it's on a radio or on somebody's device, and you hear a certain series of notes, you'll know right away what song it is, particularly if it's one that you like, or it's one that'll catch your attention. And different qualities and different features, all of that's pretty obvious stuff, and we'll get to all of that. And we'll discuss a little bit about pain, and these are just some of the things that can lead to pain. And these, and so it's not necessarily implying that they cause damage. It's just that they'll trigger certain kinds of pain receptors. Okay, and these particular fibers typically have a fair amount of glutamate. So glutamate's interesting, as you will see, even though it's typically excitatory. And substance P. And substance P it's a pain mediator. And that's that substance that when you hear about capsaicin, I've talked about that before, with particularly arthritis, the idea that this red pepper extract topically will deplete substance P in a small to moderate percentage of individuals. Okay. And then, of course, your own endogenous morphines, which we call endorphins. And we'll get into all that. And that's really something. And the distinction between referred pain and visceral pain. As I've said before, remember that homunculus, not a whole lot of fibers telling you whether it's your small intestine or large intestine, but there's a whole lot of fibers telling you not just which finger, but which part of the finger it's on. Is it the tip? Is it slightly away from you? You'll know exactly where it is. So, and referred pain, think of it this way, that the visceral fibers and the somatic fibers go along the same track. And so the brain isn't able to distinguish whether it's coming from a viscera or from the object itself. And you'll see this, it's a very famous chart. And so the classic heart attack And a lot of things can do heart attack. So it's not just chest pain and medial arm and forearm and finger pain. It can sometimes we'll see it as indigestion. Sometimes we'll see it as tightness in the throat, difficulty in swallowing. I tell the same story every time. If I walk into the emergency room and say, "Oh man, I'm having trouble swallowing. I really feel my neck feels really tight." If they look at me, 72-year-old man with blood pressure who's overweight, doesn't exercise a heck of a lot, just first 63 things they're going to try to rule out are a heart attack. Because the old story in medicine, you want to address the thing that could potentially kill somebody first. Rule that out, and then we can address, is this arthritis? Is this a stiff neck? Is this an infection? Whatever it might be. So they're very, very famous ones that are here. In the bladder, you can see that particularly it's in the lower inguinal region. But in the urine...
Sorry, I didn't want to...
That's all right, I was dictating, but we'll go ahead.
Sorry.
That's all right.
I put the tubes in the autoclave now. They're not like the regular size test tubes.
Okay.
They're smaller, but it should work out really
Just fine.
well.
Yeah, you don't need a little.
Yes. So I have to go take them out of the autoclave now.
Mm-hmm.
Is there somewhere you want me to put those? So I'm just trying to think of like where might be a good place to put them so they stay clean. And I just went ahead and I did the racks that hold 60 tubes. I just went ahead and did 2 racks. That way you have more than enough.
I'm not trying to think of where a good place would be.
I know, because I don't want anybody to take them.
Does it go back in the prep room with a note? Is there a space for it? Or back in
the prep room like areas, so like the counter spaces are so, because there's not much counter space, it's all full and used up. Can you get into my old office?
I can try.
Okay, because if you can get in there, okay. I can put them in there.
We'll do that.
And actually I can put them, so Paul got that ventless fume hood.
Right.
So I can actually put them in, if I can reach, I can put them inside the fume. The only reason why I say that is because there's a lot of stuff on the floor in front of the fume hood.
That'd be a good
might
place
be
to
difficult.
Put it. If I can get in there, Paul will get us in there. Because Katie and I are going to start to probably work on that Friday.
Oh, okay.
That's the plan.
Okay. So yeah, I will put both of those racks in there. I put the autoclave tape on the racks,
Good.
But I'm going to peel the tape off because if it sits on the racks for too long and it cools down,
hard to
then
get
you
off.
can't get the tape off.
Yeah,
but if you take it off now, it'll come off nice and easy. So what I'm going to do is, and I put the tubes in there right side up so they can get all nice and steamy. And so I know, like, obviously there's condensation in the tubes now, but I'll just flip them upside down.
Okay.
So that way they can drain and be dry when they're needed. So,
excellent.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Yeah, you're welcome.
You'll hear our conversation. It's a different class. So that was Mrs. Maurer, and she's doing this for a thing we're doing on Monday. Whenever you hear this will be Monday the 16th. So nevertheless, a couple of interesting things. When people have kidney stones, the pain in men is very often testicular or penile. In women, it's very, very low in the inguinal and the anogenital area, and that's because it's referred. The pain fibers from that area tend to travel in that location where your brain realizes it. And this one's very famous. Lung and the diaphragm. Okay, we frequently do laparoscopic surgery, both men and women, but particularly so in women because one of the ways to access tubes and ovaries a great deal. Let's do gallbladder procedures with it. First thing, what happens is we blow up the abdomen with carbon dioxide gas, which will dissipate. But what it does is it separates the organs so they're easy to effectively work on. But what it also does is it presses on the diaphragm. And that pressure on the diaphragm is why afterwards, you can't even tell how many patients go, my God, my shoulder's killing me. What'd you guys do? When the incision and the tube was inserted in the umbilical area. Go figure. So the interesting stuff that's there. And there's different kinds of pain. We see, amplification with amputations. Unfortunately, I had participated in a lot of those that were there. Phantom limb pain is sort of a variation in that. Pain management is a big player, and we'll talk about that a little bit. And a lot of times, There's special ways where we have to bury nerves because people say, oh, I still feel my foot or I still feel my hand. And you basically almost have to bury the nerves in muscle or in bone to prevent them from doing so. There's a lot of surgical technique that's involved in that. And there's different kinds of stimuli and all of these things, and we classify them. So very simply, your ears, mechanical receptors, pressure, air moving against the eardrum, vibration, and we have vibration. We have stretch receptors in a lot of areas. We certainly have in the kidney. We have stretch receptors, as you'll learn about, in the aortic and carotid arteries. They're really important mechanical receptors, so they work on pressure. The ones there in those arteries are called baroreceptors. Think of barometer or pressure gauge. Thermoreceptors, self-explanatory, they're heat receptors. Photo, we see them in the eye, because what they do is they change shape, and that shape change is what effectively creates the transmission of signal. And chemical receptors, which are certainly the most abundant. Specifically, it's a relatively new word. We sort of generally put pain receptors into chemoreceptors. Now we call them nociceptors. And all of those, because it can be pressure, it doesn't necessarily have to be chemical, even though chemicals predominate. Yes, it can be thermal in nature, even again, although chemicals predominate in that particular construct. So nociceptors, when you see that, noci means pain. So that's it. And again, externally, external structures, internally, internal viscera, stretching in blood vessels, etc. Normally, they're basically just signaling other structures. You and I don't get too involved with this. And then the proprioceptors I talked about all the time, and muscles and tendons. So wherever your body's doing or moving at the time, you know where it is. And then there's a variety of things or modifications, and I'll show them to you. We're going to talk in this chapter because they changed. Now they're all in chapter 13. So this is an older PowerPoint that they inserted with this newer text. So there used to be a special chapter for special senses called chapter 15. That's why you see sometimes the numbering, like all of a sudden for heart it'll be 18 and blood vessels will be 19. It's an older edition. With the newer editions, they combine the two. So there's a lot of different ways, and when we classify them, I'm not going to hold you to this. You either have ones that have specialized structures we call encapsulated, which are a little more sophisticated, or ones that are just free nerve endings. Typical hot, cold, sharp, dull pain are free nerve endings. So the non-encapsulated, relatively small temperature pain, light touch. Deep touch is typically encapsulated. So activated, as you can see, by temps from 10 degrees Celsius to 40 degrees Celsius. So in that area, the co-receptors can be any type of drop. You'll perceive of it that way. Once you get below that, it's just so cold, it's hard to even distinguish. But damage is being done if you're exposed to that. Heat receptors, obviously higher. So now we're getting, we're starting to get to higher levels. And I mean, 48 is rather substantial. 40 is 104. And if you add another, 40, that's now you're 115 degrees. People don't survive in that very well. And again, nociceptors are part of that, playing this role. Extreme. All of these different things can make pain. There's something called the vanilloid receptor and membranes. This is where the capsaicin, in red peppers can play a role with regard to that we were talking about. This is more specific, Itch receptors, histamine, that's typically what we leave when we have allergies. When your eyes itch, when you have allergies, or particularly if you're exposed to something you're allergic to with hives, that'll dilate blood vessels. There'll be a lot of irritation. And the Merkel cell disc, we talked about a little bit vis-a-vis Jimmy Buffett, because it's a specialized epithelial cell in the skin. They're about light touch. They sit on top of free nerve endings, and the nerve endings sort of wind around hair follicles, and we can, they're very useful in sensation. So they're showing you in illustrations. I don't want to go through them for the sake of brevity. And these are a little bit different. We get encapsulated. Now, different kinds of touch, more discreet, how you can feel something specifically with your fingers to know what it is. Pacinian corpuscles, that's how you pronounce them. pressure and vibration. And I always tell everybody, diabetics who develop neuropathy, this is the first thing to go. For whatever reason, they lose vibration. I'll show that to you in the lab. And there's different ones here. Muscle spindles play a role as our muscles respond to that. Indeed, organ muscle spindles and tendon, basically these what they call a Golgi apparatus in tendons. When you do stretching, particularly static stretching, stretch and hold it for, you're trying to disable those, because what they will to a certain extent do is cause reflex spasm. So we overload them. That's why we switch away in medicines like this. We switch away from ballistic, jumping jacks and squat thrusts type of training, and then went into more static stretching. And then we found out that you could do healing with motion was useful, and then went sort of in the Pilates direction. There's a lot to that, and I show some pictures. And then I'm going to stop here because I'm running out of time. And then I apologize because Mrs. Maurer will work on this project for these kids on campus on Monday. And I'll pick up either in lecture or maybe I'll do the supplementary portion for the spinal cord and send that to you as well. Thank you.